Good morning, everybody, and I thank the media and others who have joined us today. I'm joined at the table by Heather Tizard, who is our Chief Procurement Officer for the province, in case we get technical questions. Over the past number of weeks, our government has been implementing a number of measures to help alleviate some of the pressures facing businesses in Newfoundland and Labrador. Last week, I was delighted to announce the deferral or waiver of more than $6 million in fees, which provides a degree of relief for the business sector. We've also had significant announcements regarding support for the tourism and hospitality sector, as well as the oil and gas sector and others. We continue to dialogue with industry and listen to the matters that they're bringing forward, and wherever possible, we're working towards solutions. Today, I'm pleased to announce that a local preference provision is being added to the public procurement regulations. This provision will mandate an allowance of 10% for local suppliers for all procurements to the maximum permitted under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. As well as supporting local businesses, providing preference benefits to local suppliers helps enable additional economic, taxation, and employment benefits for the province. In addition to this preference provision, the thresholds at which an open call for bids are required will be increased to allow more opportunities for direct business to local suppliers through a limited call process. The procurement process in Newfoundland and Labrador affects all public bodies, including municipalities, health authorities, school boards, academic institutions, and government departments and agencies, as well as businesses throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. The new increased thresholds at which an open call for bids will be required for municipalities, local service districts, academic institutions, school districts, and health authorities are as follows. $105,700 for goods, that is an increase up from $10,000. $105,700 for services, up from $50,000. And $264,200 for construction, up from $100,000. These thresholds will also require the 10% local preference. The new increased thresholds at which an open call for bids will be required for departments and agencies and all other public bodies, with the exception of Crown corporations, are as follows. $26,400, up from $10,000. For goods, $105,700 for services, and that is up from $50,000, and $105,700 for construction, up from $100,000. These thresholds will also require a local preference of 10%. The new increased thresholds at which an open call for bids will be required for Crown corporations are as follows. $264,200 for goods, up from $10,000. $264,200 for services, up from $50,000. And $264,200 for construction, up from $100,000. The new thresholds for the 10% local preference for Crown corporations are as follows. $528,300 for goods and services, and $5,283,200 for construction. Any procurement below these numbers will be eligible for the 10% local preference. We will also be implementing a short-term increase to thresholds for engineering services for municipalities and local service districts from the current $100,000 to $264,200. This will allow this year's municipal construction projects to begin more quickly and maximize support for the construction and employment opportunities throughout the province. For any limited calls under these thresholds, we will maintain our preference for a 3-quote process. In addition, to ensure transparency under these new thresholds, reporting requirements will be enhanced so that any limited call between the former threshold and the new higher thresholds for public bodies will be required to publicly report the successful bidder and related award information, including the commodity, the date of the award, the financial value of the contract, the term of the contract, and any renewal options. Increasing thresholds provides greater flexibility for a more efficient procurement process. More specifically, it provides additional flexibility to direct businesses to local enterprises. Our ability to respond in an effort to help local businesses is the result of the legislation our government introduced in 2018 to modernize the public procurement framework. It now will also include consideration of opportunities for local businesses. It is progressive legislation which modernized the purchasing process in our province and focuses on best practices and how we can achieve best value for dollars spent. And today, we are seeing these improvements in action as we highlight how we can use this updated legislation to respond to the current situation. These measures that I've announced today reflect our immediate response to some of the concerns facing businesses in our province. A committee of ministers, as well as officials from several government departments, will be reviewing the policies, regulations, and legislation, and we will be consulting with the business community. The committee will report back with recommendations within 6 months to ensure that we are maximizing procurement opportunities within allowable trade provisions while ensuring the changes reflect the needs of the business community. It is our government's goal that the recommendations from the committee will lead to permanent changes that will translate into greater opportunity for businesses throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. Thank you, and we are open for questions.
Thank you, Minister Osborne. A report of questions will be asked by order of registration, so everyone is able to ask 2 questions and 1 follow-up. We will then proceed with additional rounds until the news conference ends at 11:45. First up, we have Mark Quinn from CBC. Please go ahead.
Hello, yes, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Can you summarize what you've announced today?
We've announced increased thresholds for procurement in the province, as well as a local preference policy of 10% for any bids or any tender processes below those thresholds.
And this, you mentioned it's possible because of legislation that's a couple of years old. Would it have made sense to do this, before the pandemic?
Well, the legislation was put in a couple of years ago. There was an Atlantic procurement agreement, which has since been done away with. We are now increasing our thresholds to the maximum under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. These thresholds, government has been looking at this for some time. In fact, prior to the pandemic, looking at making changes to both thresholds and procurement policies to help local businesses. There has to be a balance, obviously, in transparency in how these tenders are provided and responded to, in helping local businesses living within trade obligations, across the country, and also balancing the needs and requirements of local businesses to ensure that any changes that are put in place reflect the needs and desires of the local business community within allowable limits. So the Committee of Ministers and Officials will be ensuring that as we review policies and legislation and regulations, that we mirror the best practices that the business community want when we make absolute permanent changes to the thresholds and preference policies. We also want to ensure that the government treasury is protected through transparency as well.
And I wanted to ask you as well, Standard & Poor's...
Mark, we'll have to wait till the next round of questions. We have to allow 2 per reporter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Elizabeth Witten with Newfoundland and Labrador. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Minister, I was hoping you would go a little into how you expect these changes to help and aid businesses impacted by COVID.
These changes are immediate changes. We will see, once the Committee of Ministers and Officials do a thorough review of policy, regulations, and legislation, we'll see more permanent changes. But this will allow local businesses greater access through the 10% preference policy below Canada Free Trade thresholds. It will also, and that's across the country, for bids across the country, not just within the 3 partners of the Free Trade Agreement. But the other change, in addition to providing a 10% local preference, is we've increased the thresholds before an open bid is required, or an open bidding process is required. It allows government agencies, departments, crown corporations, and municipalities to do a limited call within the province directed at local businesses to give them a greater opportunity of ensuring that the business is there for them.
And as my follow-up, I was curious, how do these changes compare to what other provinces are doing and allowing under that free trade agreement?
Ontario and Quebec, we've increased our thresholds to exactly what Quebec is, and just slightly above what Ontario is, literally by thousands of dollars. So we mirror now what Quebec and Ontario are doing. Other provinces have local preference policies in place as well. If you look at Prince Edward Island or New Brunswick, for example, they have local preference policies within Atlantic Canada. So we are looking at putting local preference in place in this province to try and ensure that local businesses have every opportunity to do business with government. And when you look at what we're doing, if a bid or a tender is kept locally, the employment, the business tax, payroll tax, income taxes, and so on that government will collect as a result of a tender staying local, as opposed to going to a company outside of the province, there's a huge advantage not only for the business, but in return to government as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Ben Cleary from NTV. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Minister. My first question today is just for local business owners watching this, how does this announcement affect them immediately?
Well, these changes are effective immediately, and they will allow local businesses greater opportunity to do business with government departments, agencies, crown corporations, municipalities throughout the province. These changes will certainly help local businesses, providing them greater opportunity to do business with government simply by increasing the thresholds, but as well by putting in place a local preference policy.
Perfect. And as well, last week the S&P bond rating agency changed the province's outlook from stable to negative. I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's obviously concerning. The rating did not change, but the outlook did change. So our credit rating remains the same. The outlook in terms of the economy was rated as stable because of the downward pressure in oil prices globally and because of the pandemic and how it's affected the economy. The outlook has changed from stable to negative. It's certainly our hope that once we come out of the other side of this pandemic, that we'll be able to strengthen the local economy, and that's part of what this announcement today is about. You look at other provinces have had their outlooks changed, and downgrades, in fact, in credit ratings for some. Our bond rating agencies have said that the fiscal management of the Treasury in this province is an upward pressure, which is part of the reason our credit rating stayed the same. The downward pressures are Muskrat Falls, the need for rate stabilization, and what's happening globally with oil prices and the pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Brian Medor from VOCM. Please go ahead.
Good morning, Minister. One of the things always arises in a local preference policy is that it will end up costing the agency more money in the long run, i.e. you kind of eliminate or at least discourage some potential bidders, which reduces the amount of competitiveness involved in contracts. What would you say to critics who would argue that?
I mean, there is a balance, Brian. I appreciate the question because it is a good question and an important look into the changes that we've made. I'll ask Heather to step in now in a moment as well to further elaborate on what I'm about to say. But the 10% local preference, essentially, we reduced 10% from the local bid in the province before we analyze all bids, including those from outside the province. And then you apply the point rating system to bids based on the quality of the product, as well as a number of other factors, would rate into how bids are rated. But when you look at 10%, if a local company were to get a bid because of reducing the value of the bid in evaluating the tender by 10%, and you factor in business tax, payroll tax, income taxes to individuals who are working, the money in the local economy, when you factor all of those items into play, keeping local businesses in the game, giving them an opportunity to ensure, because they may not be as large as other businesses outside of the province in some cases, may not have the same competitive advantage as other businesses outside of the province in some cases. By keeping the business local, we keep people working, we keep the economy going, and the return to the Treasury will offset in large part the difference in the 10%. Heather, did you want to elaborate on this?
No, I think that covers it, Minister. It's still a competitive process, but with preference to Newfoundland and Labrador suppliers. So as the Minister mentioned, the 10% reduction, we gain employment and potentially taxation benefits for any preference that we provide to local suppliers.
And just a second question, how do you even define local? For example, Marco has the Core Science Building. I think they're an Atlantic Canadian company. Many companies are Atlantic Canadian. Operations in Halifax, perhaps St. John's, perhaps not. How do you even go about defining that? Wouldn't that be some type of massive legal document unto itself?
again, I'll answer, I'll ask Heather to elaborate, but if a company has a local presence, they're established here locally, in large part they're considered a local business. What we're looking for is people who are set up locally, paying taxes into the Treasury locally, employing people locally. Heather, did you want to elaborate?
No, the definition in the regulations will stay as the Minister referenced, that it's a supplier located here and doing business here in the province.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we have Patrick Butler from Radio Canada. Please go ahead.
Just a little follow-up about cost. Is there any sort of predicted cost that this measure would have in terms of the amount that the province would pay in procurement?
There may, in some cases, be an increase in costs for tenders, but again, it is very much offset by ensuring that people are employed locally, that the companies that are receiving the tenders pay taxes locally. Again, you're talking business tax, payroll tax, corporate income, personal income. There's a wide array of benefits to the local economy, and ensuring that local businesses survive through this pandemic, as we're doing a deeper dive into the regulations, legislation, and policies to make permanent changes, but also, to ensure that people are employed here locally.
If it was, if this is such a no-brainer, and like you say, the impact on the Treasury is somewhat mooted by the fact that there would be more economic activity in Newfoundland and Labrador. Why not have followed suit or followed what Quebec and Ontario, other provinces are doing before? What was the hesitation on the part of the province up until this point?
We started to look at this some months ago in terms of what we could and couldn't do. And more recently, the Atlantic procurement arrangements have been done away with. We were limited by Atlantic procurement arrangements. We now have greater flexibility in making changes to the thresholds and to procurement policies. There are many companies in the province that operate mostly in the province, who I know, I've spoken with some of them, suppliers and so on, who this will have an advantage to. There are other companies who deal in several provinces, but they're locally based out of this province, and they have less desire to see changes to procurement. In large part, this won't affect some of those companies because they bid on very large tenders, but there has to be a balance. Anytime you're dealing and putting provisions in place that give local preference, other provinces may respond and do likewise. So there has to be a balance in how we protect local businesses through procurement policies, and at the same time allow companies here that do business in other provinces to still have access to that business as well.
Thank you. Next, we have David Marr with the Telegram. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. With these changes, particularly with the threshold before there is a public tender process required there, are you increasing the ability of a Crown corporation like Nalcor, for example, to issue sole source contracts under these changes?
We're still asking that there be 3 bids put in place. All of the policies and restrictions that are currently in place, other than the increased threshold, will be in place. And again, I'll ask Heather to elaborate on this.
That's right, Minister. There will be no ability to sole source, only if there is one available source, so those rules haven't changed. We do have exceptions such as sole sourcing or emergency situations in our regulations, but they haven't changed as a result of these threshold changes.
Thank you. And a bit of a follow-up to... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, in addition to that, I mean, we're putting additional measures in place with this announcement today. More immediate measures in place to protect transparency. So, we've put additional measures in place today as well, and these are immediate changes to help focus on helping businesses through the pandemic. Again, ministers and officials in consultation with business will do a much deeper dive into the policies, the legislation and regulations to ensure that the proper balance is there on a more permanent basis.
And to follow up, I think on one of Brian's questions before, you talk about businesses that are not necessarily local but have a local presence. Still being able to bid for these, for these local contracts. I think of a company like S&C Lavalin with their, building up there on Topsail Road. Would they their ability to access these locally sourced contracts is unchanged by these rules? Is that correct?
If they're established in the province, they're paying tax in the province and employing people locally, they will have access to the local preference.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now have time for follow-up questions, so we will start again and work our way through the list. One question each, please. First up, we have Mark Quinn with CBC. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you again. We've heard from both physicians and even some businesses that there's the shortage of PPE, and they've asked that particularly physicians who are community-based physicians and in the small businesses that require PPE to reopen have asked that the government help them with securing a supply that's affordable, because there's such high demand for PPE that the price has, they're describing as skyrocketing. So is the government looking at any kind of measure to make PPE affordable for businesses that are reopening?
Again, I'm going to ask Heather to step in on this. Heather meets and represents the province with an FPT call weekly, every Friday. I've sat in on those calls over the past couple of weeks. It's largely a matter of supply and demand. Government is paying considerably more for PPE today than we were 3 months ago because of the global demand increase for PPE. Everybody. It's not just our government, it's governments across the country, it's governments globally that are paying more, and similarly businesses are paying that amount. We heard in the news recently about a local company paying 6 times more. That is consistent with the additional amount that government is paying. In terms of procurement, we've got a number of people within government that are working on procurement, looking at manufacturing opportunities locally for procurement, in terms of supply and getting shipments here. Heather has been working with her counterparts federally to ensure we take advantage of that. Again, Heather?
That's right, Minister. There are a number of suppliers that are cropping up now, and we're actively looking at those suppliers. My staff are working with the healthcare sector and trying to vet any new suppliers that come along to see if we can find new suppliers of PPE that can help bring those prices down. And as the Minister mentioned too, we're also looking at local manufacturing options, not just here in our province, but in other Atlantic provinces, and looking at ways that we can work with each other to try to find new sources of PPE and really reduce those prices for everybody.
Can I
follow
up?
We're going to do one question per reporter, just given our time constraints. But Mark, you can feel free to email me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Next up is Elizabeth Witten with All Newfoundland Labrador. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Minister, I was wondering if you could touch a bit more on how these changes were kind of constrained by the Free Trade Act.
Heather, did you want to step in? Heather's been working this file for a number of years. So.
Sure. Prior to now, there was a number of free trade agreements across the country and internationally that we were party to. There was an Atlantic Procurement Agreement that had been in place for a number of years and had been in place before the Canada Free Trade Agreement, and that had lower thresholds. So we were bound at that time by those thresholds in the Atlantic Procurement Agreement. But with the proliferation of other trade agreements, such as the Canada Free Trade Agreement, agreements such as the Atlantic Procurement Agreement were really deemed redundant. So we still have an MOU with the Atlantic provinces, but the thresholds were removed. So right now we're bound by the thresholds of the next higher trade agreement, which is the Canada Free Trade Agreement, and they had higher thresholds than the previous agreement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Ben Clary from NTV. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Minister, I was wondering, the Employers' Council has asked for a plan of economic recovery, and I was wondering when we could see something like that.
I'm going to answer that question. I just wanted to add, based on the previous question, our thresholds now match not only Quebec and Ontario, but they are aligned with Ottawa's thresholds now as well. In terms of, we're going to see an economic update on Thursday of this week, and that's basically to give a picture of what the closeout of the 2019-20 fiscal year looked like. In terms of a budget, I mean, we've heard from the Prime Minister and the Federal Minister of Finance, as well as other finance ministers across the country, saying that because this situation is still evolving, because we still don't know how long it's going to last or how the economy is going to recover and rebound as restrictions are lifted, it's very difficult to put a budget in place. A budget is a fiscal forecast. You're basically forecasting what you anticipate revenues and expenses will be for the fiscal year. And generally speaking, we're well within 1% of that fiscal forecast. If we were to do a budget now, I can guarantee you that we would not be within 1% because things are so uncertain in terms of the global economy and whether or not you're going to see a prolonged recession or whether things will rebound more quickly. The economists are constantly telling us that it's far too early to tell. As I said, the Federal Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister have indicated that they can't possibly put a budget in place at this particular time. Provinces who had put a budget in place have had to revise their numbers and continuously warn that those numbers will be revised again. So I'm hoping that at the earliest opportunity we'll be able to put a budget in place for this fiscal year that will give, with the greatest degree of accuracy and certainty, a forecast on what we believe revenue and expenses will be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Brian Medor from VOCM. Please go ahead.
Minister Osborne, it wouldn't surprise me if the opposition parties put out something later on today or tomorrow criticizing the policy on the basis that it essentially reduces the number of open bids that public agencies and government has to engage in. The criticism being that this gives you more opportunity to engage with companies which may be conceived as being political donors, let's say. We've seen it in the past many occasions when companies are hand-picked and the bidding process bypassed. What would your answer be to that?
The politicians don't provide the ratings on tenders. That's done by a team of officials. Again, I'll ask Heather to step in now in a moment, but that's done very independently by a team of officials in any particular department or any particular agency or Crown Corporation. We've increased the transparency with this announcement today. In addition to that, we are still requiring 3 bids and reporting of who had achieved the tender, the length of the contract, as well as a number of other factors. Again, these are immediate measures that we're putting in place, and more permanent measures will be put in place once a team of ministers and officials from a number of government departments look at the policy that government have in place, the legislation and the regulations in terms of procurement, and put in more permanent changes once we've had an ability or an opportunity to do a deeper dive. The business community will be consulted on that, and it will go through the regular process, and there will be an opportunity for opposition parties to have some say as we receive the recommendations back and look at putting any changes to policy, regulations, or legislation. Heather?
Thank you. As the Minister mentioned, there is a team that conducts an evaluation anytime a request for proposals is done. For anything like quotes or tenders, anything between the former threshold and the new thresholds, we will be publicly reporting, and every public body will be required to publicly report that information. So the value of the contract, the nature of the contract, that sort of thing. So anyone who has bid on that will be able to go on publicly and see what the awarded contract was and the value of that contract.
And Brian, further to that, if anybody wants to criticize me for trying to protect local businesses, I'll accept the criticism.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we have Patrick Butler from Radio Canada. Please go ahead.
Hi again. I just want to make sure I understand what we mean when we say when we increase the threshold to which local preference will be added. I'm reading the press release, and so like if we say $105,700 for goods for municipalities, that number, that $105,000, that threshold, that means that if a procurement amount is of that magnitude, then once the number is higher than that, then this threshold applies. I just want to understand exactly what is meant by threshold. Does that mean that that is the amount that needs to be covered from local companies? Can you just explain that a little better?
I can. So there are 2 factors when we're looking at that number. For example, there are a number of thresholds, but that with any particular threshold, so the one you'd mentioned, 105,700, that particular threshold, the requirement to do an open call increases to the new threshold. So it gives a greater ability to focus on local companies. B, 10% preference for local companies on any open call, whether it's below that, up to that value, but on any open call up to that value, there's a 10% local preference applied prior to evaluating the other factors and conditions within a bid. Again, these thresholds now mirror what Quebec and Ontario have, as well as the federal government. So, we've I guess modernized the thresholds to mirror what other provinces have put in place, and the federal government.
Thank you. Finally, we have David Marr from the Telegram. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Minister Osborne, looking ahead a little bit to the fiscal update. In December, with the economic update, the revised deficit was $943 billion. Is it safe to say that the deficit is going to be more than that on Thursday?
Thursday is only a couple of days away, David, and we'll be providing the numbers Thursday. I know that people are probably anxious to hear that number, but I mean, we've got a news conference slotted for Thursday, at which time we'll get into both revenue and expense numbers and other information as well.
Thank you. The time for questions has now ended. Please feel free to reach out to me with by email for any follow-up questions that you may have. Thank you all for participating in today's media availability.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.